Hey guys, tonight you and I are stepping way back in time, like, way back, to explore something incredibly personal and surprisingly universal: how the world has understood and tried to soothe women's anxiety throughout history. Imagine yourself tucked in, the room just right, maybe the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows as we journey through millennia. We're going to sift through ancient scrolls, peer into medieval cloisters, peek into Victorian parlors, and even brave the early days of psychiatric wards. It's a story filled with strange ideas, sometimes cruel treatments, and a persistent thread of misunderstanding wrapped around a very real human experience. You might hear things that make you cringe, or maybe even chuckle darkly at the sheer absurdity of it all. Just remember, you're safely here, listening, while those who came before navigated these choppy waters with the knowledge they had. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're settling in, letting your mind drift, as we begin our deep dive into the ancient world. Picture the scorching sun over the Nile, the air thick with the scent of river mud and incense. We're in ancient Egypt, thousands of years before anything resembling a modern doctor existed. And here you find some of the earliest documented attempts to explain what seems like anxiety, or at least, a cluster of symptoms we might recognize today as distress, nervousness, or unease, particularly in women. The prevailing theory, etched onto papyri that still survive, was, well, it was creative. It revolved around the uterus. Yes, that organ, seen not just as a vessel for life, but as something with a mind, or maybe just a will, of its own. The Egyptians believed this organ could wander around the body. Imagine that, your uterus just deciding it fancies a trip up to your chest or even your head, causing all sorts of problems along its journey. When it felt neglected, maybe lacking moisture or interaction, read, pregnancy or certain other activities, it would dry up and go looking for better accommodations elsewhere in the body. And this wandering? It caused symptoms ranging from breathlessness and palpitations to seizures and, crucially for our story, a general sense of distress or anxiety. It's a mainstream historical fact that these ancient texts, like the Kahan Gynecological Papyrus, dating back to around 1825 BC, describe these conditions and link them directly to the movement of the uterus. So if your womb was on walkabout, what did the ancient Egyptians do about it? Their treatments were, shall we say, olfactory in nature. The goal was simple: either lure the uterus back down to where it belonged or scare it away from where it shouldn't be. How? With smells. Sweet-smelling substances, think fragrant oils, resins, maybe even herbs, were applied down below, near the vagina, to entice the wandering organ back home. It's like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, but for your uterus. Meanwhile, noxious, foul-smelling substances were applied to the nose and mouth. The logic being, if the uterus had traveled upwards, these terrible smells would make it recoil and flee back downwards. Picture someone holding rotten food or burning something unpleasant near your face while someone else applied lovely perfumes elsewhere. A quirky, almost darkly comical image, isn't it? This approach wasn't just a fringe idea. It was part of their established medical practice. They believed that if the uterus was causing, say, heart palpitations, applying something awful to the nose would drive it away from the heart and back down. Fast forward a bit, across the Mediterranean, to ancient Greece. The Egyptians had their wandering womb, and the Greeks, never ones to be outdone, adopted and refined the idea. The term, hysteria, itself comes from the Greek word for uterus. Hystera. Greek physicians, most famously Hippocrates, also believed the uterus could move, though perhaps less like a tourist and more like a creature seeking moisture. They thought a dry, mobile uterus could press on nerves and organs, causing illness. Plato, the philosopher, even weighed in, describing the uterus as an animal within an animal, prone to becoming distressed and causing all sorts of ailments if it remained unproductive for too long. This concept of a mobile, problematic uterus causing a wide range of physical and emotional symptoms became a cornerstone of Western medical thought for centuries. It's another key mainstream historical fact that the Hippocratic school heavily promoted this uterine theory of disease. The Greek treatments for this supposed uterine anxiety weren't miles away from the Egyptian ones. They also used fumigation, both sweet and foul smells, applied strategically. Baths were big too, soaking in warm, sometimes medicated water was thought to soothe the restless organ. And perhaps most infamously, marriage and childbirth were prescribed as cures. The idea was that pregnancy and regular sexual activity would keep the uterus moisturized and anchored, preventing its troublesome wanderings. It's almost like the ultimate "just settle down" advice, elevated to a medical prescription. Imagine going to the doctor with a racing heart and being told, yes, your uterus is bored. Get married." A slightly awkward consultation, you might think. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians and Greeks were only describing physical symptoms with their uterine theories, or if they were genuinely attempting to explain psychological distress as well. Were the symptoms they attributed to a wandering womb, like breathlessness, palpitations, choking sensations, and a general sense of unease, purely physical manifestations of something else they didn't understand? Or did they recognize the emotional component and simply lack the language or framework to separate mind from body? It's hard to know definitively, looking back through the mists of time. What is clear is that for millennia, women's specific anatomy was seen as a primary source of their ailments, including those that sound suspiciously like what we'd call anxiety today. This focus on the uterus, this belief in its mischievous travels, laid a foundation for how women's mental and emotional distress would be viewed, and often dismissed or pathologized, for centuries to come. You can almost feel the weight of that ancient idea, this organ-centric view of female suffering, settling in for a long, unwelcome stay in medical history. Okay, so we've left the ancient Egyptians and Greeks wrestling with that restless uterus, trying to coax it back into place with smells and marriage. Now let's drift west and forward a few centuries, into the vast, sprawling Roman Empire. Imagine bustling cities, grand aqueducts, and bathhouses filled with steam and chatter. The Romans were incredibly pragmatic, great engineers, and they absorbed a lot of knowledge from the cultures they conquered, including the medical wisdom, and sometimes the not-so-wise ideas, of the Greeks. And guess what stuck around? Yep, the concept of the uterus causing trouble. But it also got layered with another hugely influential Greek medical theory, the humoral theory. This theory, refined and popularized by the incredibly influential Roman physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century AD, proposed that the human body was governed by 4 principal fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Think of them as the body's internal weather system. Each humor was associated with certain qualities: hot/cold, wet/dry, and linked to specific organs, seasons, and even temperaments. Health was a state of perfect balance between these humors. Illness, whether physical or mental, was due to an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humors. It's like your body had 4 different types of oil, and if one tank was too full or too empty, the whole engine sputtered. Now, how did this relate to anxiety, or what they might have called melancholia or other forms of nervous distress, particularly in women? The humor most often associated with conditions we might link to anxiety or depression was black bile. An excess of black bile was thought to cause melancholia, characterized by sadness, fear, irrational thoughts, and often, physical symptoms like digestive issues or skin problems. Galen and other Roman physicians saw these states not as purely psychological, but as tangible physical conditions caused by a humoral imbalance. And while the wandering womb idea might have faded slightly in prominence compared to the all-encompassing humoral framework, the belief that women's unique physiology made them particularly susceptible to certain imbalances, especially those linked to their reproductive organs, certainly persisted. Historians still argue whether Galen and his contemporaries viewed conditions like melancholia purely as humoral diseases or if they recognized a distinct mental component intertwined with the physical imbalance. So, if a Roman woman came to a physician, and yes, Roman women did seek medical care sometimes from female practitioners called medici, complaining of symptoms that sounded like anxiety, maybe heart palpitations, breathlessness, sleeplessness, and a pervasive sense of dread or fear, the doctor would likely diagnose a humoral imbalance, possibly an excess of black bile, perhaps exacerbated by issues related to her uterus if she was of childbearing age or having menstrual problems. The goal of treatment was to restore humoral balance. This wasn't about talk therapy. It was about adjusting the body's internal chemistry. The treatments could be quite varied, often involving a combination of methods aimed at removing excess humors or correcting their qualities. Diet was crucial. Foods were classified by their humoral qualities, so you might be prescribed a diet heavy in hot and wet foods if you were thought to have an excess of cold and dry black bile. Bathing was also popular, not just for hygiene but for therapeutic purposes. Specific temperatures and added herbs or minerals were used to influence the humors. Exercise was recommended, tailored to the individual's constitution and imbalance. Then there were the more interventionist approaches. To remove excess humors, Roman physicians employed methods like purging, inducing vomiting or using enemas, and bloodletting. Imagine feeling anxious and being told, "Right, let's just drain some blood out, that'll sort it." It sounds horrific to us, but it was standard medical practice, based on their understanding of the body. A mainstream historical fact is that Galen's humoral theory and the treatments derived from it dominated Western medical thought for over 1,000 years, profoundly shaping how illness, including mental distress, was understood and treated. For women specifically, treatments might still involve addressing the uterus, even within the humoral framework. If uterine issues were thought to be contributing to the humoral imbalance causing anxiety-like symptoms, remedies might include pessaries, medicated inserts, fumigation, yes, still using smells, though perhaps framed differently within the humoral context, or even recommendations for sexual activity or marriage, echoing those ancient Greek ideas about keeping the uterus happy. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Roman medicine is the use of substances like castoreum, a secretion from beaver scent glands, or various animal parts in remedies for conditions attributed to the uterus or nerves. Imagine being prescribed beaver gland extract for your anxiety. Not exactly what you'd find in today's pharmacy. The persistence of the idea that women's reproductive health was intrinsically linked to their overall physical and mental well-being is a clear thread running from Egypt and Greece through Rome. While the Romans, influenced by Galen, developed a more complex system with the humoral theory, the underlying assumption that female anatomy was a primary source of their specific ailments, including distress and anxiety, remained firmly in place. You can almost feel the weight of that historical perspective, this blend of humoral theory and gynecological assumptions, shaping how women's internal struggles were interpreted and treated, often with methods that seem bizarre or even cruel through a modern lens, but made perfect sense within the medical framework of the time. Okay, so we've seen the Romans layer the ancient Greek wandering womb idea with the sophisticated, for its time, humoral theory of Galen, diagnosing anxiety-like symptoms as imbalances of bodily fluids, particularly black bile. Now, imagine the Roman Empire beginning to crumble, classical learning fading in many places, and a new era dawning, the Middle Ages. This is a long, complex period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, and how anxiety, or mental distress, was understood shifted and fractured across different regions and times. But two major lenses emerged, sometimes overlapping, sometimes conflicting, the medical, still rooted in the humoral theory, and the religious, seeing distress through the prism of faith, sin, and the supernatural. You're journeying now into a world where life could be harsh, uncertain, and deeply intertwined with spirituality. The grand bathhouses of Rome are mostly gone, replaced by a more localized, often less sophisticated approach to medicine, especially in the early Middle Ages. However, the writings of Galen, though sometimes lost or preserved only in fragments or through Arabic translations, held immense authority. The humoral theory didn't vanish, it persisted, becoming the dominant framework for understanding illness, both physical and mental, throughout much of the medieval period in the West. An imbalance of humors was still the go-to explanation for conditions like melancholia, which, as we discussed, often encompass symptoms we now associate with severe anxiety or depression, profound sadness, irrational fears, withdrawal, and physical complaints. But the Middle Ages also brought the powerful influence of the Church. Christianity permeated every aspect of life, and explanations for suffering, including mental anguish, often took on a spiritual dimension. Was your anxiety a sign of a humoral imbalance, or was it something more? Could it be a test from God, a consequence of sin, or even the work of demons whispering doubts and fears into your ear? This religious interpretation added another layer of complexity, and sometimes fear, to the experience of mental distress. For women, already seen as potentially weaker in constitution and perhaps more susceptible to temptation, thanks, Eve, this could be particularly fraught. Was her anxiety a medical issue, a spiritual one, or a combination of both? Treatments, therefore, could range from the medical to the spiritual. If diagnosed as a humoral imbalance, medieval physicians, often educated in monasteries or, later, in emerging universities, would prescribe remedies based on Galenic principles. This meant diet and lifestyle adjustments tailored to correct the supposed imbalance, perhaps avoiding certain foods classified as cold or dry, if excess black bile was suspected. Herbal remedies were widely used, sometimes based on ancient knowledge, sometimes on local tradition, with specific plants believed to have properties that could influence the humors or soothe the nervous system. And yes, the more drastic humoral treatments persisted. Purging, using laxatives or emetics, and bloodletting were still common practices aimed at ridding the body of excess humors. Imagine feeling overwhelmed by anxiety and being told you need to be bled. It sounds counterintuitive now, but it was mainstream medical thought. A mainstream historical fact is that the humoral theory, particularly as codified by Galen, remained the bedrock of Western medicine throughout the Middle Ages, influencing diagnoses and treatments for a vast array of conditions, including mental afflictions. On the religious side, the approach was different. Anxiety might be seen as a spiritual struggle requiring prayer, confession, penance, or even exorcism if demonic influence was suspected. Monasteries and convents sometimes offered refuge for those suffering from mental distress, providing structured prayer and care, though this was often framed within a spiritual rather than a purely medical context. Pilgrimages to holy sites were also seen as potentially curative, offering spiritual solace and a physical journey away from the source of distress. For a woman experiencing intense anxiety, a confessor might probe for hidden sins, while a physician might check her pulse and recommend a specific herbal concoction or a bloodletting session. Historians still argue whether the religious explanations for mental distress in the Middle Ages primarily replaced medical ones, or whether they existed side by side, sometimes even integrated. Did people genuinely believe their anxiety was caused by demons, or was that a framework for understanding something they couldn't otherwise explain, alongside the physical explanations offered by humoral theory? It's likely the reality was complex, varying by individual, region, and the specific symptoms presented. A person might seek both medical and spiritual help, seeing no conflict between purging their humors and praying for divine intervention. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era involves the use of amulets and talismans. Beyond official medical and religious practices, people often turn to folk remedies and superstitious practices. Carrying specific stones, wearing charms inscribed with prayers or symbols, or performing certain rituals were believed to ward off evil spirits or negative influences that could cause distress. Imagine being given a small piece of inscribed bone or a particular crystal and told it would calm your racing thoughts. A far cry from modern medication, but a testament to the diverse ways people sought relief. The intertwining of medical, humoral, and religious explanations meant that diagnosing and treating anxiety-like symptoms in medieval women was a complex affair. Was her distress due to a cold, dry uterus causing an excess of black bile, or was she being tempted by the devil? The answer might involve dietary changes, bloodletting, prayer, and perhaps even an amulet. The focus on women's unique physiology persisted, often linked to the uterus or seen through the lens of their perceived emotional or spiritual fragility. The belief that women were inherently more prone to humoral imbalances or spiritual weakness could make their experience of anxiety particularly burdensome, potentially leading to both invasive physical treatments and spiritual judgment. You can feel the weight of these twin perspectives, the physical imbalance and the spiritual struggle, shaping the medieval understanding of a woman's anxious mind, a blend of ancient medical theory and the pervasive influence of faith. Okay, so we've navigated the medieval landscape, where the humoral theory of Galen bumped up against spiritual explanations for distress. Now, feel the air shift as we move into the Renaissance, roughly from the 14th to the 17th centuries. This was a time of rebirth, a rediscovery of classical art, philosophy, and yes, ancient medicine. And guess whose ideas got a major glow-up? Hippocrates and Galen. Their texts were translated, studied, and became the absolute bedrock of medical understanding. So, while the world was experiencing a revolution in art and science, the explanation for what we might call anxiety, particularly in women, remained firmly rooted in those ancient concepts. The dominant framework was still the humoral theory. Illness, including states of mental distress, was seen as an imbalance of those four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And the condition most closely aligned with persistent fear, sadness, irrational thoughts, and general unease was still melancholia, attributed to an excess of black bile. During the Renaissance, melancholia became a particularly fascinating, almost fashionable, concept, especially among intellectuals and artists. It was seen as a complex state, sometimes linked to genius and contemplation, but also to profound suffering and even madness. But for women, the narrative was often different. While a male scholar might be seen as possessing a noble melancholy, a woman's melancholia was more likely to be viewed solely as a physical illness, a weakness of constitution, or still, frustratingly, linked to her reproductive organs. The old idea that the uterus was a source of trouble didn't disappear. It merely got integrated more firmly into the humoral system. A dry, suffocating uterus was still thought to cause problems, sometimes by generating noxious vapors that traveled through the body and affected the brain, leading to melancholic or hysterical symptoms. Or it might be seen as contributing to a humoral imbalance, perhaps by affecting the production or flow of black bile. Physicians like Thomas Sydenham, though slightly later, in the 17th century, bridging Renaissance and early modern, would still write extensively about hysteria, as a condition almost exclusive to women, varying in its symptoms and often linked to the uterus, describing symptoms that sound remarkably like severe anxiety, panic attacks, and depression. This persistent focus on the female anatomy as the root cause meant that a woman experiencing anxiety was often seen through a very specific, often limiting, lens. It wasn't just a person with an imbalance. It was specifically a woman's imbalance, tied to her nature and her body. So, if you were a woman in the Renaissance experiencing racing thoughts, palpitations, inexplicable fears, or profound sadness, symptoms we'd put under the anxiety/depression umbrella, you would likely be diagnosed with melancholia or perhaps hysteria, both seen as physical ailments caused by humoral imbalance, often exacerbated by your female physiology. The treatments aimed to restore balance. This often involved complex and sometimes unpleasant regimens. Diet was meticulously controlled, avoiding foods thought to produce black bile, like beef or lentils, and favoring those believed to lighten the humors. Lifestyle recommendations included moderate exercise, fresh air, though not too much, and avoiding stressful situations, which sounds vaguely modern until you get to the other stuff. Purging remained a staple. This meant prescribing potent laxatives or emetics to literally expel the offending humors from the body. Bloodletting was also still widely practiced. Depending on the perceived severity of the imbalance and the patient's constitution, a physician might recommend bleeding from a specific vein, sometimes even timing the procedure according to astrological charts, as the influence of stars and planets on the body's humors was taken seriously. Imagine feeling weak and anxious and having a physician decide the best course of action is to make you weaker by draining some blood, perhaps only on a Tuesday when Mars is in retrograde. It's a bizarre blend of science, as they understood it, tradition, and superstition. A mainstream historical fact is that humoral theory, particularly Galen's framework, remained the dominant medical paradigm throughout the Renaissance, profoundly influencing the diagnosis and treatment of mental conditions like melancholia and hysteria. Herbal remedies became increasingly sophisticated during this period, with detailed pharmacopoeias being compiled. Specific herbs were prescribed for their supposed properties, some to purge humors, others to soothe the nerves, and still others to influence the uterus. Ingredients could be incredibly varied and complex, often mixed into elaborate concoctions. Opium, often in the form of laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, began to be used more widely as a sedative, offering temporary relief from distress, though its addictive properties were poorly understood. Baths and mineral waters were also popular treatments, believed to help balance humors through their temperature and mineral content. While the religious explanations for mental distress didn't vanish entirely, people still believed in divine influence and the possibility of demonic temptation. The emphasis shifted somewhat, particularly within learned medical circles, back towards physical causes rooted in humoral theory and physiology. However, folk beliefs and local practices often blended medical and spiritual approaches. A woman might still wear an amulet while also taking an herbal purge prescribed by a physician. Historians still argue whether the increased focus on melancholia in the Renaissance reflected a genuine increase in such conditions, a change in how they were categorized, or simply the intellectual and cultural fascination with the concept driven by the rediscovery of classical texts. Did more women become anxious, or were their existing anxieties simply pathologized more specifically within the prevailing medical framework? It's hard to say definitively, but the language and treatments certainly became more detailed, even if the underlying theory was ancient. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Renaissance medicine involves the use of sympathetic remedies. This wasn't just about balancing humors. It was sometimes based on resemblances or symbolic connections. For instance, remedies for conditions affecting the head might involve plants that look like brains or skulls. For melancholy, which was associated with darkness and heaviness, treatments might involve seeking out bright, cheerful environments, listening to uplifting music, or even wearing specific colors. Imagine being told your anxiety needs to be cured by attending a brightly lit party and wearing a sunny yellow dress. Maybe not entirely ineffective from a modern perspective, but based on a completely different, non-humoral logic. The Renaissance, with its explosion of knowledge and art, paradoxically solidified some very old ideas about women's health and mental distress. The wandering womb was still a concept, albeit perhaps framed differently within the humoral system. Melancholia was the diagnosis, often seen as a physical ailment tied to female nature and imbalances. Treatments were still focused on purging, bleeding, and complex remedies aimed at fixing the body's internal chemistry. You can feel the weight of these ancient ideas, given new life by the Renaissance scholars, continuing to shape how women's anxiety was understood, or perhaps misunderstood, for centuries to come, a blend of rediscovered classics and persistent, sometimes bizarre, practices. Okay, so we've left the Renaissance with its blend of rediscovered Galen and persistent ideas about women's melancholia tied to humors and anatomy. Now, imagine stepping into the early modern period, say from the late 16th through the 18th centuries. This is the era of the scientific revolution, of detailed anatomical studies, of microscopes peering into tiny worlds, and of a growing, though slow, shift away from pure ancient authority. You might think that with all this new knowledge about the human body, the idea of a uterus literally wandering around causing anxiety would finally be laughed out of the dissecting room. And you'd be mostly wrong. While the crude idea of the uterus physically migrating like a little internal tourist did start to fade among the most learned physicians, the fundamental belief that the uterus, and women's reproductive system in general, was the primary source of their specific ailments, including mental and emotional distress, stubbornly persisted. The term, hysteria, became even more entrenched, now used as a catch-all diagnosis for a huge range of symptoms in women, everything from fainting spells and paralysis to irritability, insomnia, breathlessness, and yes, intense anxiety and inexplicable fears. It was still seen as a physical condition, but the mechanism was often described differently. Instead of a wandering womb, physicians theorized about vapors, or spirits, rising from a disordered uterus, traveling upwards through the body, and wreaking havoc on the brain and nervous system. Think of it like a toxic gas leak from your reproductive organs messing with your head. Charming, right? Prominent physicians of the era, like Thomas Willis, who gave us the term neurology, and Thomas Sydenham, often called the English Hippocrates, wrote extensively about hysteria, diagnosing it almost exclusively in women. They described its symptoms in vivid detail, attributing them to this uterine influence. Sydenham, in particular, noted the incredible variability of hysterical symptoms, likening it to a chameleon. A mainstream historical fact is that despite advances in anatomy and physiology during the early modern period, the concept of hysteria as a condition originating in the uterus and causing a vast array of physical and psychological symptoms remained a dominant medical explanation for women's distress. This deeply ingrained belief meant that a woman's anxiety wasn't just seen as anxiety. It was female anxiety, rooted in her essential nature and anatomy. So, if you were a woman in this era experiencing what felt like overwhelming anxiety, maybe panic attacks, a constant knot of fear in your stomach, inability to sleep, or strange physical sensations, a physician would likely diagnose you with hysteria, caused by those pesky uterine vapors. The treatments were still primarily physical, aimed at either calming the supposed uterine disturbance or driving the vapors away. Humoral theory hadn't completely vanished, but the focus on the uterus as a specific source of humoral imbalance or vapor production intensified for women. Treatments could be quite vigorous, sometimes even violent, aimed at shocking the uterus, or the vapors, into submission. Strong-smelling substances were still used, sometimes applied directly near the vagina, sweet smells to soothe or draw vapors down, or held to the nose, foul smells to drive vapors away from the head. Imagine trying to cure your anxiety by sniffing rotting cheese while someone applies perfume elsewhere. Sounds like a great time. Pessaries, often medicated with strong or irritating substances, were inserted into the vagina, ostensibly to directly influence the uterus. Fumigation, involving directing smoke or vapors from burning herbs or other substances towards the genital area, was also practiced. General treatments included bleeding and purging, still mainstays aimed at removing excess humors or expelling noxious substances from the body. Baths, particularly cold baths or douching with cold water, were sometimes prescribed as a way to shock the system and calm the nerves or uterus. Herbal remedies continued to be used, often aimed at promoting menstruation, as a blocked uterus was thought to cause vapor buildup or calming spasms. Opium and other sedatives became more common, offering temporary relief from the distressing symptoms, though without addressing the underlying cause, as they understood it. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the use of uterine massage, or manipulation by midwives or physicians. While sometimes presented as a medical treatment, the description of these procedures, often involving vigorous manipulation of the pelvic area, sometimes veers into territory that sounds less like therapy and more like, well, something else entirely. The idea was to physically manipulate the uterus to dislodge blockages or release trapped vapors. Imagine going in for anxiety treatment and ending up with a rather forceful internal massage. Not exactly relaxing. Historians still argue whether the persistent focus on the uterus in explaining women's distress in the early modern period was purely a continuation of ancient medical tradition, or whether it also served a social function, pathologizing and controlling women's emotional expression by framing it as a physical defect inherent to their sex. Was it genuinely believed medical science, or a convenient way to dismiss female complaints? It's a complex question with no easy answer, likely a mix of both. Despite the groundbreaking anatomical discoveries happening concurrently, they were literally mapping the nervous system and understanding circulation in new ways. The old, deeply ingrained ideas about women's bodies being inherently fragile and prone to specific, uterus-driven ailments meant that their anxiety was filtered through this specific, limiting lens. It's like building a super-advanced computer but still running it on a medieval operating system when it comes to women's health. You can feel the weight of that historical inertia, those ancient ideas about the female form and its supposed inherent instability, continuing to define and constrain how women's internal struggles were perceived and treated, often with bizarre and invasive methods that seem utterly disconnected from the actual experience of anxiety. You've just witnessed how, even as dissection rooms got busy and microscopes got better, the old ghost of the uterus still haunted medical explanations for women's anxiety in the early modern period. Now, feel the intellectual winds shift again as we sail into the Age of Enlightenment, roughly the 18th century. This was a time buzzing with new ideas, reason, and a growing fascination with the body's internal workings, particularly that complex network of wires we call the nervous system. Physicians and philosophers began to focus less on wandering organs or humoral imbalances. Though those ideas didn't vanish overnight, they just started to feel a bit old-fashioned, and more on the concept of nerves themselves as the seat of sensation, emotion, and illness. This new focus gave rise to the concept of nervousness. Instead of just vapors rising from the uterus, distress was increasingly attributed to an overstimulated, weakened, or improperly functioning nervous system. Think of your nerves like delicate strings on an instrument. If they were too taut, too loose, or constantly jangled, you'd produce disharmony, or in this case, symptoms like irritability, fatigue, sleeplessness, palpitations, and that familiar cluster of fears and unease we're tracking, anxiety. This shift was significant because it moved the supposed source of the problem, at least partially, from a single organ, the uterus, to a broader, though still poorly understood, bodily system. And who, in this era, was thought to have the most delicate nerves of all? You guessed it, women. The prevailing cultural and medical view was that women were inherently more sensitive, both emotionally and physically, than men. This sensitivity was linked directly to their supposedly finer, more easily disturbed nervous systems. This wasn't necessarily framed purely negatively. In the upper classes, having nerves, or being prone to nervousness, could even be seen as a mark of refinement, intelligence, and a deep capacity for feeling, qualities highly valued in the age of sensibility. A woman who swooned elegantly or suffered from delicate nerves might be seen as more attuned to the world, more emotionally profound. It was like saying, "Oh, she's so sensitive, she simply must have fragile nerves." Imagine that as a compliment. So, for a woman in the Enlightenment experiencing anxiety, the diagnosis was likely nervousness, or vapors, a term that lingered, now often linked to nervous irritation rather than just uterine fumes, or still, the broad label of hysteria, but explained through the lens of nervous system dysfunction. Her distress wasn't necessarily seen as a moral failing or purely a humoral issue anymore, but as a consequence of her refined, yet fragile, physical constitution. A mainstream historical fact is that the 18th century saw the rise of nervous pathology, with conditions like neurasthenia and hypochondria, though the latter was often applied to men as well, becoming prominent diagnoses, and women were disproportionately seen as susceptible due to their perceived nervous fragility. Treatments for nervousness in the Enlightenment were varied, reflecting the blend of old ideas, new theories, and practical approaches. Lifestyle prescriptions were key. Physicians recommended avoiding overstimulation. Too much excitement, too much study, too much social engagement could all jangle those delicate nerves. Rest was often prescribed, along with gentle exercise like walking or riding. Diet was still considered important, though perhaps less strictly humoral and more focused on avoiding stimulants like strong tea or coffee. Tonics and bracing remedies were popular, aimed at strengthening the nervous system. These might contain alcohol, opium, still widely used in preparations like laudanum, or various herbal extracts believed to have calming or fortifying effects. Cold baths or showers were sometimes recommended to brace the nerves. Travel, particularly to spa towns with mineral waters or to the countryside for fresh air and tranquility, became a fashionable prescription for nervous ailments among those who could afford it. Imagine your doctor telling you to just take a relaxing European spa vacation to cure your anxiety. Sounds pretty good compared to bloodletting. While the focus shifted to nerves, some older practices persisted, especially in folk medicine or among less progressive practitioners. Vaginal fumigation or other uterus-focused remedies might still be employed, though perhaps justified with new language about stimulating or calming the nerves connected to the reproductive organs. The idea that sexual activity or marriage could help settle the nerves also lingered, echoing those ancient prescriptions. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on female nervousness in the Enlightenment was purely a medical theory based on the emerging understanding of the nervous system, or whether it was also a social construct that reinforced gender roles, pathologizing women's emotional responses and limiting their activities by framing them as physically fragile. Was it genuine medical observation, or a convenient way to keep women in their place by emphasizing their inherent weakness? It's likely another complex interplay of medical thought and societal expectations. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era involves the use of electrical treatments. As understanding of electricity grew, some practitioners experimented with applying mild electrical currents to the body, including for nervous conditions. The idea was that electricity might stimulate or rebalance the nervous system. Imagine going to a doctor for your anxiety and being told, "All right, let's just run a little current through you, that should perk up those nerves." Definitely a sparky approach to mental health. The Enlightenment, while ushering in new scientific ideas, filtered the understanding of anxiety in women through the lens of nervous fragility and refinement. The wandering womb was mostly retired, at least from polite medical discourse, replaced by the delicate, easily disturbed nervous system. While this might sound like a step forward, framing women's distress as an inherent physical weakness tied to their sex still served to pathologize their experiences and reinforce societal expectations about their limited capacity compared to men. You can feel the weight of this new layer of explanation, this idea of inherent female nervous fragility, adding another complex dimension to the historical understanding and treatment of women's anxiety, moving from organs and humors to nerves and sensibility, but still often ending up in the same place of constraint and misunderstanding. Okay, so we've left the age of enlightenment, where your anxiety might have been diagnosed as delicate nerves needing a bracing cold bath or a trip to the countryside. Now, bundle up and step with me into the Victorian era, that long stretch of the 19th century, a time of corsets and steam engines, rigid social rules and burgeoning industrial cities. The concept of nerves didn't disappear. If anything, it intensified. Women, particularly middle and upper-class women, were still widely seen as inherently more nervous, more susceptible to emotional and mental distress due to their supposedly fragile constitutions and the pressures of their limited societal roles. The diagnosis of hysteria remained incredibly common, a catch-all for almost any symptom that couldn't be easily explained, ranging from fainting and paralysis to irritability, insomnia, and of course, anxiety, panic attacks, and depression. It was like, if a Victorian woman felt anything other than placid contentment, someone was ready to slap the hysteria label on her and blame her overtaxed nervous system. The perceived increase in nervous ailments during this period led to the development of specific treatments, two of the most famous, or infamous, being the rest cure, and for more severe or persistent cases, institutionalization in asylums. Imagine you are a woman in the late 19th century, perhaps feeling overwhelmed, anxious, unable to cope with the demands placed upon you. You might complain of headaches, fatigue, racing thoughts, or a general sense of dread. Your physician, likely a man, would probably nod gravely and diagnose you with neurasthenia, a term meaning nerve weakness, or hysteria, attributing it to the stresses of modern life combined with your inherent female delicacy. Enter the rest cure, popularized by American physician S. Weir Mitchell. This was a treatment specifically designed for nervous women, particularly those suffering from neurasthenia or hysteria, which often manifested with symptoms we'd recognize as anxiety and depression, alongside physical complaints. The core idea was extreme rest and isolation. Patients were often removed from their homes and families and confined to bed for weeks or even months. They were forbidden from reading, writing, sewing, or engaging in any intellectual or physical activity. They were often not allowed to see visitors, sometimes not even family. Their diet was often restricted, frequently limited to milk and other simple foods. Nurses controlled every aspect of their day, often feeding them, bathing them, and even turning them over in bed. The goal was to force the nervous system to rest and recover from perceived overstimulation. It's like being sent to your room, but for 3 months, with someone spoon-feeding you and absolutely no Netflix. A mainstream historical fact is that where Mitchell's rest cure was a widely accepted and popular treatment for nervous disorders in women during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, prescribed by physicians on both sides of the Atlantic. The rationale behind the rest cure was based on the prevailing understanding of neurasthenia and hysteria as conditions of nervous exhaustion. The belief was that women's limited physical and mental capacity made them particularly vulnerable to depletion, and complete inactivity was needed to rebuild their strength. Mitchell believed that many women's nervous ailments were exacerbated, if not caused, by attempting activities deemed unsuitable for their sex, like excessive reading, writing, or engaging in social reform. The cure was, in part, designed to enforce traditional gender roles and restore women to a state of passive domesticity. Imagine being told your anxiety is because you read too many books, and the cure is to lie still and do nothing. It sounds less like treatment, and more like punishment for stepping out of line. Side by side with the rest cure, for women whose symptoms were deemed more severe, unmanageable at home, or perhaps accompanied by behaviors considered disruptive to social order, institutionalization in asylums became a common fate. Asylums were expanding rapidly during the Victorian era, initially envisioned as places of moral treatment and quiet refuge, but often becoming overcrowded and understaffed custodial institutions. Women were admitted for a vast array of reasons, including diagnoses of melancholia, mania, and yes, hysteria or general nervousness. Their symptoms might include severe anxiety, panic, agitation, or simply being deemed difficult, unmanageable, or eccentric by their families. Once inside, treatments could vary widely, often including prolonged baths, sedatives, like opium or bromide, forced feeding, and sometimes, physical restraints. The focus was often on control and containment rather than therapeutic intervention aimed at understanding or alleviating the patient's distress. Historians still argue whether Victorian asylums were primarily places of genuine care and attempted treatment, or whether they served more as dumping grounds for individuals, particularly women, who didn't conform to societal expectations or whose families couldn't or wouldn't care for them at home. While the rest cure and asylum treatments were presented as medical interventions, their application was deeply intertwined with Victorian gender norms. Women were expected to be delicate, emotional, and primarily focused on home and family. Any deviation from this ideal, including expressing distress or anxiety in ways that disrupted the household or challenged expectations, could be interpreted as a sign of illness requiring intervention. The rest cure, by enforcing complete passivity and isolation, effectively removed women from their social roles and reinforced the idea that their well-being depended on physical inactivity and dependence. Asylum admission, even if for genuine distress, could lead to a loss of autonomy and social stigma that was often difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era, related to treatments for women's nervous conditions and hysteria, involves the development and use of early vibrators. Yes, really? Physicians believed that hysteria was linked to sexual frustration or pelvic congestion, echoes of those ancient ideas about the uterus needing moisture or stimulation. Manual massage by the physician was sometimes used to induce paroxysms, orgasms, which were believed to relieve the congestion and alleviate symptoms. This was a time-consuming and, for the physician, potentially awkward process. The invention of electromechanical vibrators in the late 19th century provided a more efficient way to achieve this therapeutic outcome. Imagine going to the doctor for your anxiety and being prescribed, well, you get the picture. It highlights how deeply intertwined women's perceived mental distress was with their reproductive and sexual health in the medical thinking of the time. The Victorian era, with its emphasis on nervous exhaustion and the fragility of the female constitution, solidified treatments like the rest cure and institutionalization as responses to women's anxiety and distress. These methods, while framed medically, were heavily influenced by societal expectations and often served to reinforce traditional gender roles, pathologizing women's experiences and limiting their autonomy. You can feel the weight of this era's approach, the quiet isolation of the rest cure room or the imposing walls of the asylum, representing a period where women's anxiety was treated not just as an illness, but often as a problem to be contained, controlled, and wrested out of existence, often with methods that seem astonishingly restrictive and even cruel from our modern perspective. So, you've been put through the rest cure, lying still for months, or maybe you've been admitted to an asylum, the heavy doors closing behind you. This is the late Victorian era, the turn of the 20th century, a time when medicine was rapidly professionalizing, and a new field was trying to stake its claim: psychiatry. Before this, people dealing with mental distress might see a general physician, a neurologist, or end up in an asylum run by a superintendent who might have medical training, but the dedicated specialty of understanding and treating the mind was just beginning to form. And as this new field emerged, its early approaches to women's anxiety and distress were, shall we say, experimental and often harsh. Psychiatrists, or alienists as they were sometimes called, were trying to understand conditions like hysteria and neurasthenia, those broad labels still slapped onto women experiencing everything from fatigue and headaches to full-blown anxiety, panic attacks, and what we'd now call depression. While some forward-thinking individuals were starting to consider psychological factors, many early psychiatrists were still deeply rooted in the physicalist view of the time. They believed these conditions were caused by biological problems, perhaps a weakened nervous system. Remember those delicate nerves from the Enlightenment? Hormonal imbalances, yes, the ovaries were now getting some of the blame the uterus used to shoulder, or even just poor constitution. The prevailing societal view of women as inherently more emotional and fragile also heavily influenced these early diagnoses and treatments. A woman's anxiety wasn't just seen as a personal struggle. It was pathologized as a manifestation of her fundamental female nature or a defect in her biology. With this physicalist mindset, treatments often focused on directly intervening with the body, sometimes quite drastically, in an attempt to shock the system back into equilibrium or remove perceived sources of irritation. While milder treatments like diet, baths still popular, from cold plunges to prolonged warm soaks, and tonics continued, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of more invasive procedures. One such approach was hydrotherapy, which could range from gentle showers to being wrapped in wet sheets, sometimes cold, sometimes hot, or subjected to powerful jets of water. The idea was that manipulating body temperature and circulation could influence the nervous system and the mind. Imagine feeling overwhelmed by anxiety and being essentially hosed down or wrapped up like a human burrito, not exactly the calming image you might associate with modern therapy. Then came the various forms of shock treatment, though not yet the electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, we might think of today. These early methods were designed to produce a strong physiological reaction, believed to somehow reset the nervous system or interrupt the disordered thought patterns. One method was insulin coma therapy, introduced in the 1930s, a bit later than the strict turn of the century, but part of this era of early psychiatric interventions, where patients were given large doses of insulin to induce a hypoglycemic coma. The idea was that the shock of the coma would alleviate mental symptoms. Another was the use of induced seizures, sometimes caused by injecting chemicals like camphor or metrazole. These were incredibly risky procedures, with significant side effects and mortality rates, and the mechanism by which they might have helped some patients was poorly understood. A mainstream historical fact is that early psychiatric hospitals experimented with a range of physical treatments, including various forms of induced shock and hydrotherapy, based on the belief that mental illness had a primarily biological cause that could be physically manipulated. For women, particularly those diagnosed with severe hysteria or agitation associated with their anxiety, treatments could also become frighteningly invasive and linked, yet again, to their reproductive organs. Oophorectomy, the surgical removal of the ovaries, was sometimes performed on women diagnosed with mental illness or severe, nervous, symptoms, including anxiety. The rationale was that the ovaries were the source of hormonal imbalances or irritations that caused mental distress. It sounds barbaric now, But in a time when the connection between hormones and behavior was barely understood, and the ovaries were still seen with some of the mystical suspicion once reserved for the uterus, removing them was considered a legitimate, albeit extreme, treatment option for women whose symptoms were deemed intractable. Imagine going to a doctor for panic attacks and being told the solution is to surgically remove your ovaries. It highlights how deeply ingrained the belief was that women's minds were inextricably linked to, and often controlled by, their reproductive biology. Historians still argue whether these early, harsh psychiatric treatments were primarily driven by genuine, albeit misguided, scientific inquiry, or whether they also reflected societal biases and a desire to control or contain individuals, particularly women, whose behavior deviated from the norm. Were they truly trying to cure, or were they trying to subdue? It's a complex question, likely involving elements of both flawed medical understanding and societal pressure. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era involves the use of nerve tonics and patent medicines widely available over the counter. While not strictly psychiatric treatment in the clinical sense, these concoctions were heavily marketed towards women suffering from nerves, anxiety, and malaise. They often contained high levels of alcohol, opium, or bromide, providing temporary relief but also leading to dependency and other health problems. It was the Wild West of pharmaceuticals, essentially, where you could buy a bottle promising to cure your anxiety, and it might just be mostly booze and opiates. Imagine picking up a bottle labeled Dr. Goodfield's Miracle Nerve Elixir from the local chemist, hoping it would calm your racing thoughts, only to find yourself hooked on laudanum. The birth of psychiatry brought a new lens through which to view women's anxiety and distress, but it was a lens still clouded by outdated biological theories and societal assumptions about female fragility. The treatments that emerged were often physical, invasive, and sometimes terrifying, ranging from hydrotherapy and induced shock to, in extreme cases, the surgical removal of reproductive organs. The asylum remained a common destination, and even within its walls, the focus was often on managing symptoms through physical means rather than exploring the underlying emotional or psychological causes. You can feel the weight of this era's approach, the cold shock of the water, the fear of the needle, the desperate hope that a physical intervention could somehow quiet the turmoil of the mind, a stark and often brutal chapter in the history of treating women's anxiety. Okay, so we've emerged from the era of bracing cold baths, forced rest, asylum walls, and the sometimes terrifying physical interventions of early psychiatry, like induced shock or even surgery aimed at calming a woman's supposed nervous agitation or hysteria. It feels like the focus has been relentlessly on the body, whether it was wandering organs, imbalanced humors, delicate nerves, or problematic ovaries. But as the 20th century dawned, a revolutionary new idea began to take hold, one that dared to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, the source of a woman's distress wasn't just in her physical form, but in the intricate, hidden landscape of her mind. Step forward onto the scene, Sigmund Freud. Imagine Vienna at the turn of the century, a city buzzing with intellectual energy, hidden anxieties beneath a polished surface. Freud, a neurologist by training, was working with patients, many of them women diagnosed with hysteria, whose symptoms, paralysis, tics, sensory loss, and yes, profound anxiety, panic attacks, and inexplicable fears, seemed to have no physical cause. He'd seen the limitations of the prevailing treatments, and was unsatisfied with explanations that simply blamed weak nerves or restless uteruses. Remember those? Influenced by earlier work using hypnosis, which seemed to alleviate symptoms by accessing forgotten memories, Freud began to develop a radically different approach. His central idea was the concept of the unconscious mind. He proposed that beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts and feelings lies a vast reservoir of repressed memories, desires, and conflicts, stuff too painful, shameful, or forbidden to be allowed into conscious awareness. And this buried material, he argued, didn't just disappear, it festered, manifesting as psychological symptoms like anxiety, phobias, and hysterical conversions, where psychological distress turned into physical symptoms. For women, living under the strict social constraints of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, with limited outlets for expression and immense pressure to conform. The idea that their distress stemmed from repressed desires or traumatic experiences suddenly offered a new framework. It suggested their anxiety wasn't just inherent biological weakness, it was a meaningful signal from a troubled inner world. A mainstream historical fact is that Sigmund Freud's development of psychoanalysis fundamentally shifted the understanding of mental distress from a purely biological or physical problem to one rooted in psychological conflict and the unconscious mind, profoundly influencing 20th century thought. So, if you were a woman in the early 20th century, suffering from symptoms that felt overwhelming, perhaps you found your way to a psychoanalyst's office. Instead of being put to bed for months or subjected to hydrotherapy, you would be invited to lie on a couch, yes, that couch, which has become almost a caricature, but was a deliberate part of the setting to encourage relaxation and introspection. The analyst would sit out of your line of sight, creating a less direct, less intimidating atmosphere than a face-to-face medical examination. And then, you would be asked to talk. This was the core of the talking cure. You would be encouraged to engage in free association, saying absolutely anything that came to mind, no matter how trivial, embarrassing, or illogical it seemed. The idea was that by letting your thoughts wander without censorship, you would bypass your conscious defenses and allow glimpses into the unconscious material that was causing your distress. You might talk about your childhood, your relationships, your dreams, which Freud saw as a royal road to the unconscious, your fears, your desires. The analyst would listen, occasionally offering interpretations of patterns, symbols, or resistances that emerged, helping you to uncover the repressed conflicts driving your anxiety. Imagine the sheer novelty of this. After centuries of being told your problem was a restless organ or weak nerves, someone was finally saying, "Tell me what's going on inside your head. Your feelings and thoughts matter." This approach was revolutionary, particularly for women whose voices had been historically silenced or dismissed when it came to their own suffering. It offered a space where their internal experiences were taken seriously, where their anxieties could be explored as complex psychological phenomena rather than just physical malfunctions. It provided a narrative, a story about why they felt the way they did, linking their present distress to past experiences and hidden dynamics. For many, simply the act of speaking freely and being listened to, perhaps for the first time about these deeply personal matters, was profoundly therapeutic. It validated the reality of their internal struggles in a way that physical treatments never could. Of course, Freud's theories were not without their problems, especially when it came to women. His ideas about female psychology, particularly concepts like penis envy and the Oedipus complex's different trajectory in girls, were deeply rooted in the patriarchal assumptions of his time and are widely criticized today. He often interpreted women's symptoms through a lens that prioritized male development and saw female experience as a deviation or lack. So, while the method of the talking cure offered liberation, the interpretations offered could sometimes reinforce limiting or pathologizing views of women. Historians still argue whether Freud's psychoanalytic theories, despite their revolutionary focus on the mind, ultimately empowered or further constrained women through their specific content and interpretations. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this era of psychoanalysis is the intense focus Freud and his followers placed on seemingly insignificant details: a slip of the tongue, a Freudian slip, a recurring dream image, a seemingly random memory. They believed these were not random at all, but carefully coded messages from the unconscious. So, if you accidentally called your boss Dad, or dreamt about a snake, your analyst might spend significant time dissecting its hidden meaning. It's kind of like being told every typo you make is a deep psychological revelation. Must have made proofreading terrifying. Despite the controversial aspects of his specific theories about women, the core contribution of psychoanalysis, the idea that mental distress, including anxiety, stems from psychological factors, often rooted in early experiences and the unconscious, and can be explored and potentially resolved through talking, was a monumental shift. It moved the conversation from physical plumbing to the inner landscape, offering women a language and a framework for understanding their own complex internal lives, even if the language itself was sometimes flawed. You can feel the weight of this intellectual shift, moving from the harsh, external interventions of the past to the quiet, internal exploration on a couch, offering a new, albeit imperfect, path towards understanding and alleviating the persistent burden of anxiety. So, you've just settled onto the couch, ready to explore the hidden depths of your unconscious with Freud or one of his followers, finally moving away from the idea that your anxiety is just bad humors or a misbehaving uterus. And yes, the talking cure was a huge step, a seismic shift in thinking about mental distress. But while psychoanalysis was gaining ground, particularly in intellectual circles, the search for physical ways to fix the troubled mind was far from over. In fact, as the 20th century wore on, it entered a new, sometimes even more frightening phase, marked by the dawn of chemical interventions and some truly drastic surgical measures. Imagine stepping out of the analyst's office and into a different kind of medical facility altogether, one focused not on talking, but on altering the physical stuff of your brain. The early part of the 20th century saw the tentative beginnings of what we might recognize as psychiatric drugs, though they were a far cry from the targeted medications of today. Barbiturates, initially used as sedatives and anesthetics, started being prescribed more widely for anxiety and insomnia. They could offer temporary relief from racing thoughts and physical tension, but they were highly addictive and came with significant side effects, including drowsiness and impaired judgment. Amphetamines, known for their stimulant effects, were sometimes used to treat what was then called neurasthenia, or mild depression, the idea being to boost energy and lift mood, even though they could exacerbate anxiety in many people. It was a bit like trying to fix a broken engine by pouring in whatever liquid you had lying around. Sometimes it helped a little, sometimes it made things much, much worse. These weren't specific anti-anxiety medications. They were more like blunt instruments used to try and manipulate overall mood and energy levels. A mainstream historical fact is that early 20th century physicians increasingly turned to sedative and stimulant drugs like barbiturates and amphetamines as pharmacological tools to manage symptoms of anxiety, depression, and insomnia before the development of more targeted psychotropics. But alongside these early chemical experiments, the era also saw a resurgence of belief in radical physical interventions for mental illness, driven by a growing understanding, though still very limited, of the brain's structure. If the problem was in the brain, maybe you could just fix the brain directly? This thinking led to one of the most controversial procedures in the history of psychiatry, the lobotomy. Imagine the concept: if certain parts of the brain are causing distressing symptoms like severe anxiety, agitation, or obsessive thoughts, maybe you can just disconnect them. What could possibly go wrong? The procedure, formerly known as a leucotomy or lobotomy, involved severing the connections in the brain's frontal lobe, which was thought to be the seat of higher emotions and complex thoughts, from other parts of the brain. The most famous proponent was Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz, who developed the procedure in the 1930s. His method involved drilling holes in the skull and injecting alcohol to destroy brain tissue, or using a specialized instrument called a leucotome to cut the nerve fibers. Later, American physician Walter Freeman popularized a faster, more brutal version, the transorbital lobotomy, performed by inserting an ice-pick-like instrument under the eyelid and tapping it through the thin bone of the eye socket into the brain, then sweeping it back and forth to sever connections. No drilling required. Just a quick tap, tap, tap. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, and for many patients, it was. Lobotomy was performed on tens of thousands of people worldwide, including many women diagnosed with conditions like schizophrenia, severe depression, and yes, chronic, debilitating anxiety and agitation. The rationale was that by disconnecting the emotional centers from the higher cognitive functions, the patient would become calmer, less agitated, and less troubled by their distressing thoughts or feelings. And sometimes, it did make patients calmer. But often, the cost was devastating. Patients frequently experienced profound personality changes, becoming listless, apathetic, impulsive, or losing their ability to function independently. It wasn't a cure, it was often a reduction to a more manageable, but fundamentally altered, state of being. Imagine having your anxiety cured by becoming essentially a different, less vibrant person. A mainstream historical fact is that lobotomy, particularly the prefrontal lobotomy, was widely performed between the 1940s and 1950s as a treatment for various severe mental illnesses, despite uncertain outcomes and significant risks of permanent cognitive and personality damage. The rise of lobotomy highlights a complex and troubling period. On the one hand, there was a genuine desire to alleviate immense suffering in patients for whom no other treatments seemed effective. On the other hand, it reflected a shocking lack of understanding of the brain, a willingness to perform irreversible surgery with little scientific basis, and arguably, a societal desire to eliminate behaviors deemed disruptive, particularly in women who might be labeled as difficult, hysterical, or unmanageable due to their anxiety or other symptoms. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of lobotomy was a desperate measure born of the lack of effective alternatives for severe mental illness, or whether it also reflected societal biases, a rush to embrace a seemingly scientific solution without proper ethical consideration, and a desire for control over nonconforming individuals. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era, though deeply controversial, is that Agos Moniz actually won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949 for his development of the lobotomy procedure. This award came at the height of the procedure's popularity, before its devastating long-term consequences became fully apparent, and before effective psychiatric medications offered less destructive alternatives. It's a stark reminder of how quickly a radical, unproven intervention can gain acceptance, and even acclaim based on initial, often superficial, observations of its effects, especially in the absence of better options. Imagine winning science's highest honor for figuring out how to essentially scramble someone's brain. Yikes. So, as the mid-20th century approached, if you were a woman struggling with severe anxiety, you might still encounter echoes of the past. Perhaps a doctor who still believed in extended rest or hydrotherapy. But you were increasingly likely to face a landscape dominated by the promise, and peril, of physical intervention. You might be prescribed sedatives that dulled your distress but clouded your mind, or in more severe cases, you might be considered a candidate for a procedure that could literally change who you were by altering the structure of your brain. It was a time of searching for biological answers, sometimes with incredibly invasive and harmful methods. A stark contrast to the introspective journey offered by the talking cure, and a chilling chapter in the long history of trying to quiet the anxious female mind. So, you've navigated the dark hallways of early psychiatry, where the talking cure offered a glimmer of psychological insight, but the physical interventions, the shock, the surgery, the blunt instrument drugs, loomed large, particularly if you were a woman whose distress was deemed disruptive or severe. As we move into the mid-20th century, say the 1950s and 60s, the landscape of mental health treatment, and specifically how women's anxiety was addressed, began to shift dramatically again. While psychoanalysis continued, a new revolution was brewing, one that would bring a little pill into almost every anxious household and introduce a completely different way of thinking about behavior itself. Imagine the post-war era, suburban growth, television sets in living rooms, and a growing sense of unease beneath the surface of apparent prosperity. Women were facing complex societal shifts, encouraged back into traditional domestic roles after wartime work, yet exposed to new ideas and pressures. Anxiety, whether labeled as nerves tension, or simply feeling overwhelmed, was incredibly common. And the existing treatments felt insufficient. Psychoanalysis was expensive and time-consuming, inaccessible to most. Lobotomy was increasingly seen as brutal and unpredictable. The older sedatives were addictive and risky. The world was ready for something new, something easier, something that promised to simply make the anxious feelings go away. Enter the era of the tranquilizer. In the 1950s, a new class of drugs arrived that specifically targeted anxiety and tension, without causing the extreme sedation or high risk of addiction associated with barbiturates. At least, initially, the risks were underestimated. The most famous of these early drugs was Miltown, meprobamate, introduced in 1955, quickly followed by the benzodiazepines, like Librium, chlordiazepoxide, in 1960 and Valium, diazepam, in 1963. These drugs were marketed as miracle pills for anxiety, tension, and everyday stress. They promise to smooth out the rough edges of modern life, allowing you to cope without feeling constantly on edge. Imagine the relief. A doctor could give you a prescription, and within an hour, the knot in your stomach might loosen, the racing thoughts might slow down. It seemed like a revelation. These drugs were incredibly popular, particularly among women. By the mid-1960s, Valium was one of the most prescribed drugs in the Western world. Women were often the primary target of pharmaceutical marketing, depicted in advertisements as overwhelmed housewives whose lives were made manageable by a little pill. The message was clear: if you felt anxious, tense, or unhappy, it was a medical problem that could be solved with a chemical solution. This era saw the medicalization of everyday stress and unhappiness, framing it as a treatable condition rather than a natural response to difficult circumstances or societal pressures. A mainstream historical fact is that the 1950s and 1960s marked the beginning of the Age of Tranquilizers, with drugs like Miltown, Librium, and Valium being widely prescribed, disproportionately to women, for anxiety and stress. While tranquilizers offered rapid, albeit temporary, relief for many, they also brought new problems. Addiction became a significant issue, as patients developed tolerance and dependence on the drugs. The side effects, though less severe than barbiturates, included drowsiness, confusion, and withdrawal symptoms. And crucially, they didn't address the causes of anxiety, merely masked the symptoms. It was like putting a bandage on a deep wound instead of cleaning and stitching it. Parallel to the rise of pharmaceuticals, a completely different approach to mental distress was also gaining traction: behavioral therapy. Moving away from the deep dives into the unconscious favored by psychoanalysis, behaviorists focused solely on observable behavior and how it was learned and could be unlearned. Influenced by psychologists like B.F. Skinner and his work on operant conditioning, and later by therapists like Joseph Wolpe who developed systematic desensitization, the idea was that anxiety, phobias, and other psychological problems were simply learned maladaptive behaviors or responses. If you learned to be anxious in certain situations, you could be taught to respond differently. For a woman struggling with specific anxieties or phobias, perhaps a fear of going outside, agoraphobia, which was often linked to hysteria in previous eras, a fear of social situations, or panic attacks triggered by particular events, behavioral therapy offered a practical, step-by-step approach. Instead of exploring childhood traumas or repressed desires, a behavioral therapist would work with you to identify the specific triggers for your anxiety and develop strategies to change your response. Techniques like systematic desensitization involve gradually exposing you to the feared situation or object, starting with something mildly anxiety-provoking, like thinking about it, and slowly progressing to more challenging exposures, like actually being in the situation, while teaching you relaxation techniques to manage your fear response. Imagine having a debilitating fear of crowds, and instead of talking about your relationship with your mother for years, a therapist helps you practice relaxation while looking at pictures of crowds, then standing near small groups, then eventually walking into a busy store. It was a very different kind of intervention. Behavioral therapy was seen as more scientific and measurable than psychoanalysis, rooted in laboratory experiments and observable outcomes. It offered relatively short-term, focused treatment for specific problems, making it more accessible to a wider range of people than psychoanalysis. While it didn't delve into the complex emotional landscape in the same way as the talking cure, it provided practical tools for managing distressing symptoms and changing problematic behaviors. Historians still argue whether the rise of tranquilizers and behavioral therapy in the mid-20th century represented a genuine advancement in treating anxiety, or whether it contributed to an oversimplification of complex human distress, favoring symptom management and behavioral modification over deeper psychological understanding. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era, reflecting the behavioral focus, is the use of aversion therapy for certain conditions, sometimes including anxiety disorders linked to specific triggers. This involved pairing the unwanted behavior or trigger with an unpleasant stimulus, like a mild electric shock or a nausea-inducing drug, in an attempt to create a negative association and extinguish the behavior. Imagine trying to cure your social anxiety by getting a shock every time you thought about talking to someone new. Not exactly positive reinforcement. So, as the mid-20th century unfolded, the options for a woman experiencing anxiety expanded significantly. You could still seek the long-term, introspective journey of psychoanalysis, or you could turn to the rapidly growing field of pharmacology for a pill that promised quick relief, or you could explore the practical, behavior-focused techniques aimed at changing your learned responses. This era marked a clear turning point, moving away from the purely physical interventions of the past and embracing both chemical and behavioral approaches, laying the groundwork for the treatment landscape we recognize today, even as it introduced new challenges like drug dependence and the debate over whether managing symptoms was enough. So, you've navigated the mid-century landscape where a little pill could offer quick relief from anxiety, and therapists started focusing on changing your learned behaviors rather than delving into your deepest unconscious. As we move into the late 20th century, say from the 1970s onwards, the story takes another significant turn, driven by advances in brain science and the evolution of both pharmaceutical and psychological treatments. Imagine stepping into a world where the brain is increasingly seen not just as a network of delicate nerves, but as a complex chemical factory and information processing system, and where therapy gets more structured and practical. This era saw a huge leap forward in our understanding of neurochemistry. Researchers began to pinpoint specific neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers in your brain, that seem to play a role in mood and anxiety. Serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, these names started becoming central to explaining psychological states. This growing knowledge fueled the development of new psychiatric medications that were more targeted than the older sedatives and general mood lifters. While benzodiazepines like Valium remained widely prescribed for immediate anxiety relief, concerns about their addictive potential and side effects spurred the search for alternatives. This search led to the development of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, in the 1980s. Drugs like Prozac, fluoxetine, Zoloft, sertraline, and Paxil, paroxetine, targeted the serotonin system, aiming to increase the amount of serotonin available in the brain's synapses. The theory was that imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin contributed to conditions like depression and anxiety. These drugs were often perceived as having a better side effect profile and lower addictive potential than benzodiazepines, making them suitable for longer-term use. Imagine being told that your anxiety wasn't a moral failing, a wandering organ, or even just weak nerves, but possibly a chemical imbalance in your brain that could be corrected by taking a pill that adjusted your serotonin levels. It was a powerful, and for many, a hopeful message. A mainstream historical fact is that the introduction of SSRIs in the late 1980s and 1990s revolutionized the pharmacological treatment of depression and anxiety disorders, quickly becoming some of the most prescribed medications in history. The widespread adoption of SSRIs meant that for women experiencing anxiety, a visit to their general practitioner could easily result in a prescription. This medicalized anxiety further, framing it primarily as a biological issue treatable with medication. While these drugs offered relief for many, they weren't a magic bullet. They didn't work for everyone, could have significant side effects, though different from older drugs, and like tranquilizers, didn't necessarily address the underlying life circumstances or learned patterns contributing to the anxiety. They managed the symptoms, providing a chemical buffer against overwhelming feelings. Simultaneously, talk therapy was also evolving. While psychoanalysis continued, its long-term, less structured approach wasn't for everyone. Behavioral therapy, as we saw, focused on observable actions. Emerging from the blend of behavioral approaches and the growing understanding of cognition, thoughts, came cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Imagine taking the practical focus of behavioral therapy and adding a deep dive into how you think. CBT proposed that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected, and that negative or irrational thought patterns contribute significantly to psychological distress, including anxiety. For a woman struggling with anxiety, a CBT therapist would work with you to identify your specific anxious thoughts, those worries, fears, and negative self-assessments that fuel your distress. You'd learn techniques to challenge these thoughts, evaluate their validity, and replace them with more balanced or realistic perspectives. Alongside this cognitive work, you'd continue with behavioral techniques, like gradual exposure to feared situations, similar to systematic desensitization, but now integrated with changing your thought processes during the exposure. Imagine your therapist helping you identify the specific catastrophic thoughts you have before a social event. Everyone will judge me, I'll say something stupid, and then teaching you how to question those thoughts. What evidence do I have for this? What's the worst that could realistically happen? While also practicing being in social situations. CBT was typically more structured, time-limited, and goal-oriented than psychoanalysis, making it more accessible and appealing to many. This era also saw significant changes in how mental health conditions, including anxiety, were diagnosed and categorized. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association, became increasingly influential. With each revision, the DSM-3 in 1980 was a major turning point. Diagnostic categories became more specific and defined. Broad labels like hysteria finally faded from official use, replaced by more specific anxiety disorders like panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, social phobia, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, which was categorized as an anxiety disorder at the time. This provided a common language for clinicians and researchers, allowing for more standardized diagnosis and study. However, critics argued that this increasing specificity also led to the medicalization of normal human experiences, pathologizing everyday worry or shyness as a disorder requiring treatment. Historians still argue whether the increasing specificity of diagnostic categories in the DSM in the late 20th century primarily improved the understanding and treatment of distinct mental illnesses or contributed to the over-medicalization of normal human experiences. For women, this meant that their experience of anxiety was now more likely to be diagnosed as a specific disorder rather than a vague nervousness or hysteria. This could be validating, offering a name and potential treatment plan for their suffering. But it also embedded their distress within a medical model that sometimes overlooked the significant social, cultural, and economic factors contributing to women's anxiety. Issues like gender roles, workplace stress, or balancing family responsibilities, which the older, broader labels sometimes implicitly encompassed. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the cultural phenomenon surrounding Prozac in the 1990s. It wasn't just a medication, it became a symbol, discussed in books, Prozac Nation, magazines, and on television. It was hailed by some as a lifestyle drug that could make you better than well, and criticized by others for promoting emotional flatness or masking real problems. Imagine the dinner party conversations shifting from discussing your neighbors' nerves to debating the societal implications of a little green and white capsule. So, as the 20th century drew to a close, a woman experiencing anxiety entered a world shaped by neuroscience, targeted pharmaceuticals, and structured talk therapy. The conversation had moved decisively towards the brain as the primary site of distress and towards specific, diagnosable disorders. Treatment options included popping a pill to adjust brain chemistry, engaging in focused therapy to change thoughts and behaviors, or often, a combination of both. The ancient wandering womb and medieval demons felt like distant, almost unbelievable echoes, replaced by neurotransmitters and cognitive distortions, marking a profound shift in how the persistent burden of anxiety was understood and, for better or worse, treated. Okay, so we've spent a long time journeying through the Western world, from ancient Egypt and Greece, through Rome, the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and right up to the modern era of SSRIs and CBT. We've seen women's anxiety blamed on wandering uteruses, imbalanced humors, delicate nerves, faulty brain chemistry, and even unresolved childhood conflicts. But the story of how humans have understood and tried to soothe mental distress, particularly in women, isn't just a Western one. As we ease into this part of our journey, let's lift our gaze beyond Europe and North America and consider, even briefly, how different cultures around the globe have approached anxiety-like symptoms in women throughout history. Imagine stepping off the familiar paths we've been traveling and entering vastly different landscapes, where the explanations and treatments for a troubled mind might feel utterly foreign, yet also touch on universal human experiences of fear, worry, and unease. Across Asia, Africa, indigenous communities, and other non-Western traditions, the understanding of mental distress, including what we might recognize as anxiety, has often been deeply integrated with spiritual beliefs, community dynamics, and holistic views of the body and mind that differ significantly from the biomedical model that came to dominate the West. There wasn't necessarily a specific diagnosis equivalent to generalized anxiety disorder or panic attack in these systems, but there were concepts and frameworks for understanding and addressing states of persistent worry, fearfulness, agitation, and associated physical symptoms. The idea that the mind and body are separate, a concept that influenced Western medicine for centuries, though less so now, was often less pronounced. Instead, distress was frequently seen as a disruption of the individual's balance, not just internally, but often in relation to their community, their environment, or the spiritual world. Take traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, for example, a system with a history stretching back thousands of years. In TCM, health isn't just the absence of disease, it's a state of harmony and balance between opposing forces, yin and yang, and the smooth flow of vital energy, qi, through the body's meridians. Emotions are seen as natural responses, but excessive or prolonged emotions can disrupt the flow of qi and affect specific organs. Worry, for instance, is often associated with the spleen and can lead to symptoms like fatigue, digestive issues, and yes, excessive rumination and anxiety. Fear is linked to the kidneys and can manifest as panic or phobias. A woman experiencing anxiety-like symptoms might be diagnosed with an imbalance in her qi, perhaps a stagnation or deficiency, affecting relevant organs based on her specific symptoms. This wasn't framed as a problem with her uterus per se, though gynecological health is a key part of TCM, but as a systemic imbalance where emotional factors played a direct role in physical health. A mainstream historical fact is that traditional Chinese medicine has developed a sophisticated and enduring system of diagnosis and treatment, including herbal medicine, acupuncture, and dietary therapy, used for centuries to address a wide range of physical and emotional imbalances, including those we would classify as anxiety. Treatments in TCM for what we'd call anxiety would focus on restoring balance and promoting the smooth flow of qi. This might involve acupuncture, inserting fine needles into specific points on the body to influence energy pathways. Herbal remedies, often complex formulas tailored to the individual's specific pattern of imbalance, would be prescribed, some to calm the spirit, others to strengthen weakened organs, like the spleen or kidneys, and still others to move stagnant qi. Dietary changes, exercise like Tai Chi or Qigong, gentle movements to cultivate and move qi, and lifestyle advice aimed at managing emotions and reducing stress would also be part of the treatment plan. Imagine being told your anxiety is because your qi is stuck, and the solution involves tiny needles and drinking a tea made from roots and herbs that smells interesting. A bit different from popping a Valium, wouldn't you say? In Ayurvedic medicine, originating in ancient India, health is understood as a balance of three fundamental energies or dashas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Each person has a unique combination, but imbalances can arise due to diet, lifestyle, stress, or other factors. Vata, associated with air and space, governs movement, including nerve impulses and thought processes. An imbalance in Vata is often linked to nervousness, restlessness, insomnia, and anxiety. The mind is also seen as having qualities, gunas, sattva, clarity, rajas, activity, and tamas, inertia, and an excess of rajas can contribute to agitation and worry. For a woman experiencing anxiety, an Ayurvedic practitioner would assess her dominant dasha and the nature of her imbalance. This wouldn't be about a chemical imbalance in the Western sense, but an energetic and functional one rooted in the body's fundamental principles. Ayurvedic treatments aim to bring the dashas back into balance through diet, lifestyle, herbal remedies, and purification therapies, panchakarma. For Veda-related anxiety, recommendations might include warming, grounding foods, a regular routine, gentle exercise like yoga, meditation, and calming herbs like ashwagandha or brahmi. Massage with warm oils is also often prescribed to soothe the nervous system. Veda. Spiritual practices, including prayer and meditation, are frequently integrated into treatment, recognizing the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit. Imagine being prescribed a specific type of oil massage and a daily meditation practice to calm your anxious thoughts. A more tactile, sensory approach than cognitive restructuring. Beyond these formalized systems, many indigenous and traditional cultures viewed mental distress through lenses of spiritual imbalance, social disharmony, or disconnection from nature or ancestral spirits. Anxiety might be seen as a sign that a person was out of alignment with their community, had offended a spirit, or was suffering from the effects of sorcery. Healing often involved community rituals, ceremonies, prayers, storytelling, and the use of sacred plant medicines, facilitated by traditional healers or shamans. The focus was often on restoring the individual's connection to their social and spiritual world, addressing the distress within a collective, rather than purely individual, context. A quirky or fringe tidbit from some indigenous traditions involves healing rituals that include dramatic performances, drumming, or chanting, designed to engage the community and the spiritual realm in the healing process, sometimes involving symbolic journeys or battles against malevolent forces believed to cause illness. Imagine your anxiety treatment involving a community dance and a shamanic journey, certainly a different kind of group therapy. Historians and anthropologists still argue whether concepts of anxiety and other mental health conditions are universal human experiences that manifest differently across cultures, or whether they are largely culturally constructed, shaped by the specific beliefs, social structures, and language of a given society. Is the feeling of persistent worry the same everywhere, just explained and treated differently, or does the cultural framework itself shape the very experience of distress? It's a fascinating and complex debate. What's clear is that while Western medicine often focused on locating the problem within the individual body, uterus, nerves, brain chemicals, many non-Western traditions adopted more holistic views, seeing distress as a disruption of interconnected systems: body, mind, spirit, community, and environment. The treatments reflected this, often involving not just physical remedies but also spiritual practices, community support, and efforts to restore harmony with the wider world. This broader perspective reminds us that our Western historical narrative, while important, is just one way among many that humanity has tried to grapple with the persistent presence of anxiety in our lives, particularly for women navigating the pressures and expectations placed upon them within their specific cultural contexts. You can feel the weight of these different worldviews, offering alternative paths to healing, paths less traveled by the Western story we've primarily explored, but rich with their own history and wisdom. Okay, so we've just taken a whirlwind tour around the globe, catching glimpses of how anxiety-like symptoms in women were seen through lenses beyond the Western medical tradition, from chi imbalances in China to dasha disruptions in India, and spiritual disharmony in indigenous cultures. And while these perspectives offered alternatives to the wandering wombs and delicate nerves we've spent so much time with, they also, in their own ways, highlight a recurring theme: the experience and expression of anxiety, particularly for women, is almost always intertwined with the social roles and expectations placed upon them by their specific societies. As we ease back into the flow of our main historical narrative, let's consider how the shifting sands of societal expectations have impacted women's anxious lives, and how those expectations, in turn, shaped the way their distress was understood, labeled, and treated throughout history. Think back to those ancient Egyptian and Greek ideas about the wandering womb. Why was the uterus seen as so central to women's ailments, including their emotional distress? Because, in those patriarchal societies, a woman's primary value and purpose were often tied directly to her reproductive capacity, her ability to bear children. If the uterus wasn't doing its job, i.e., if she wasn't pregnant or having regular sexual activity, it was literally seen as getting restless and causing problems. The medical explanation was inseparable from the social expectation. The prescription for anxiety-like symptoms was often marriage or childbearing, not just because it might keep the uterus moisturized, a rather charming medical theory, right? But because fulfilling her expected social role was deemed essential for her well-being. It's like saying, "Oh, you're stressed? Maybe you just need to get married and have babies. Problem solved." If only it were that simple. Fast forward through the humoral theories of Rome and the Middle Ages. While the medical framework was about bodily fluids, the underlying societal view often saw women as having a weaker constitution, both physically and emotionally, making them more susceptible to imbalances. This wasn't just medical theory. It was reinforced by religious and social beliefs about women's nature. Their anxieties or melancholia could be seen as stemming from inherent frailty, perhaps exacerbated by the demands of domestic life or, conversely, by stepping outside those bounds. The Renaissance, with its renewed focus on classics, brought back the wandering womb idea, but also layered it with the concept of melancholia. While male melancholy could be framed romantically or intellectually, women's melancholia was more often pathologized as a physical illness, tied to their reproductive organs or perceived emotional instability. Again, the medical diagnosis served to underline a societal view of women as fundamentally different, and often weaker, than men, with their distress rooted in their specific female biology and nature. Then came the Enlightenment's age of nerves. Women were seen as having particularly delicate nervous systems, making them prone to nervousness. This wasn't just a medical observation. It was deeply embedded in the social ideal of the refined, sensitive lady of leisure, whose delicate sensibilities and fragile nerves were almost a mark of her upper-class status. However, this also meant that any deviation from calm composure could be pathologized. Her anxiety wasn't just a feeling, it was proof of her inherent nervous fragility, a fragility that conveniently aligned with the societal expectation that she shouldn't be overtaxing herself with intellectual pursuits, business, or public life. Her delicate nerves were both a sign of her refinement and a justification for keeping her within the protected sphere of the home. It's like her anxiety was a built-in excuse for why she couldn't run for office or, lift anything heavy. The Victorian era took this to an extreme with the diagnosis of neurasthenia and the rest cure. Women were seen as particularly vulnerable to nervous exhaustion due to the pressures of modern life combined with their supposedly limited energy and capacity. The rest cure wasn't just about curing nerves. It was about enforcing the ideal of the passive, homebound woman. By confining women to bed, forbidding them from reading or writing, and making them completely dependent on others, the treatment mirrored and reinforced the very societal roles that some historians argue contributed to their distress in the first place. Imagine your doctor saying, "Your anxiety is because you're doing too much. Go lie down for 3 months and think about what you've done," which is nothing, because you're not allowed to think either. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian medical literature and popular culture widely portrayed women as inherently more prone to nervous disorders like hysteria and neurasthenia due to their sex, often linking these conditions to the stresses of female life and reinforcing the idea that women's health depended on adherence to traditional roles. Even the early days of psychiatry, with its physical interventions and asylum admissions, were influenced by social roles. Women were disproportionately admitted to asylums for behaviors that might simply be considered nonconformist or challenging to patriarchal authority, labeled as hysterical, difficult, or unmanageable. Their distress was often seen as a problem to be contained or eliminated, sometimes through drastic physical means, rather than explored as a valid response to oppressive circumstances. The surgical removal of ovaries for mental illness, while framed medically, also reflected a deep-seated belief that women's emotional lives were dictated by their reproductive biology, reinforcing the idea that their bodies, specifically their female parts, were the source of their problems. The rise of psychoanalysis offered a new lens, exploring internal conflict. And for women, living in societies with strict sexual mores and limited avenues for self-expression, the idea of repressed desires and conflicts resonated. However, even Freudian theory, as we noted, was shaped by the patriarchal society it emerged from, sometimes interpreting women's experiences through a male-centric lens. The mid-20th century brought tranquilizers, and who were the primary consumers? Often, housewives bombarded with images of perfect domesticity while navigating the unspoken anxieties and frustrations of limited roles. Pharmaceutical marketing explicitly targeted women, framing their everyday stress and unhappiness as a medical problem requiring a pill. The solution offered was individual, chemical, and didn't challenge the societal structures that might be contributing to their distress. It was easier to give a woman a Valium than to question why her life felt overwhelming. Even the specificity of modern diagnostic labels like GED or panic disorder, while offering clarity, can sometimes inadvertently detach anxiety from its social context. While we now understand the biological and psychological components, the reality is that societal factors, gender inequality, workplace stress, the burden of unpaid care work, exposure to trauma and violence, continue to disproportionately impact women's mental health, including their experience of anxiety. Historians still argue whether the historical pathologization of women's anxiety was primarily a reflection of genuine, albeit misunderstood, biological differences, or whether it was largely a form of social control, using medical labels to explain away or suppress female distress and enforce societal norms. It's likely a complex interplay, where evolving medical theories were always filtered through and influenced by the prevailing social expectations of gender. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the intersection of social roles and perceived female fragility is the historical phenomenon of vapors, or the spleen, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. These were vague ailments, often accompanied by anxiety, irritability, or fainting, that were seen as highly respectable and almost exclusively affecting upper-class women of sensibility. It was a way to express distress in a socially acceptable manner, a kind of fashionable illness that didn't challenge gender expectations and could even enhance a woman's image of delicate refinement. Imagine your anxiety being not just accepted, but almost chic because it proved how sensitive you were. Ultimately, the history of treating women's anxiety is inseparable from the history of women's place in society. Their anxious lives have been interpreted, constrained, and treated through lenses heavily colored by expectations about their bodies, their minds, and their roles. From the ancient idea that a woman's uterus needed to be kept busy to prevent emotional distress, to the Victorian belief that her nerves couldn't handle intellectual effort, to the modern reality that women often bear a disproportionate burden of stress, societal roles have always shaped the narrative. Understanding this history isn't just about old medical theories. It's about recognizing how deeply ingrained social biases have influenced our understanding of a fundamental human experience, and how those biases continue to impact how women's anxiety is perceived and addressed today. You can feel the weight of these centuries of expectation, layered onto the very real experience of anxiety, shaping not just the treatments, but the very way the distress itself was understood. So, you've journeyed with me from the ancient world where your anxiety might have been blamed on a restless uterus or imbalanced humors, through the eras of delicate nerves, forced rest, asylums, and the arrival of talking cures, tranquilizers, and targeted medications like SSRIs. We've seen how deeply intertwined your distress has been with societal expectations and medical theories, often pathologizing your experience based on your sex. Now, as we settle into the present moment, breathing in the quiet air of tonight, let's reflect on where we are today in understanding and treating women's anxiety, and what the future might hold. Today, the dominant understanding of anxiety is far more complex and nuanced than a simple wandering organ, or even a single chemical imbalance. We largely operate from a biopsychosocial model. This means we recognize that anxiety is influenced by a combination of factors: biological, genetics, brain chemistry, physiological responses, psychological, thought patterns, learned behaviors, past experiences, trauma, and social, environment, relationships, culture, societal pressures, economic factors, gender roles. Your anxiety isn't just one thing. It's likely a confluence of many different forces acting upon you. This integrated view is a significant step away from centuries of trying to pinpoint a single physical cause solely within the female body. For women experiencing anxiety today, the treatment options are more varied and arguably more evidence-based than ever before. Psychotherapy remains a cornerstone, with cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, often being a first-line recommendation due to its proven effectiveness for various anxiety disorders. You might work with a therapist to identify and challenge those negative thought patterns that fuel your worries, or gradually face situations you fear while learning coping mechanisms. Other forms of therapy are also widely used, such as exposure and response prevention, ERP, for OCD, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, for managing intense emotions, and psychodynamic therapy, which, while different from classical psychoanalysis, still explores how past experiences and unconscious patterns influence present distress. Imagine having a menu of therapeutic approaches, tailored to your specific needs, rather than just being told to lie down for 3 months or, inhale some foul-smelling fumes. Pharmacological treatments also continue to play a major role. SSRIs and other antidepressants that affect neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine are widely prescribed for chronic or severe anxiety disorders. Benzodiazepines are still used, though often for short-term or acute anxiety due to concerns about dependence. Other medications might also be used depending on the specific type of anxiety or co-occurring conditions. The understanding of how these drugs work is constantly evolving, moving beyond the simplistic, chemical imbalance theory to a more complex picture of how they influence neural circuits and brain function over time. A mainstream historical fact is that controlled clinical trials have demonstrated the efficacy of both specific psychotherapies, such as CBT, and certain pharmacological agents, particularly SSRIs, in significantly reducing the symptoms of various anxiety disorders, leading to their widespread adoption as standard treatments. Beyond medication and traditional talk therapy, there's a growing recognition of the importance of lifestyle factors and complementary approaches. Exercise is increasingly understood as a powerful tool for managing anxiety, influencing brain chemistry and reducing stress hormones. Mindfulness and meditation practices, rooted in ancient traditions but secularized and studied scientifically, are popular for cultivating present-moment awareness and reducing rumination. Yoga, breathing exercises, ensuring adequate sleep, and maintaining a balanced diet are all part of a holistic approach often recommended alongside therapy or medication. It's like we're finally circling back to some of those older, broader ideas about balance and lifestyle, but with the added benefit of scientific understanding. However, despite these advances, challenges remain, particularly for women. Societal pressures haven't disappeared, they've simply evolved. Women still disproportionately shoulder caregiving responsibilities, face gender discrimination in the workplace, navigate body image pressures amplified by social media, and are more likely to experience trauma, which is a significant risk factor for anxiety disorders. The medical system, while improved, isn't perfect. Women's symptoms are still sometimes dismissed or misdiagnosed, and access to affordable, quality mental health care remains a barrier for many. Historians still argue whether the modern diagnostic categories, while offering specificity, adequately capture the complex interplay of social, cultural, and individual factors that contribute to women's unique experience of anxiety, or whether they sometimes reduce complex distress to a checklist of symptoms. The conversation is also expanding to include intersectionality, recognizing that a woman's experience of anxiety is shaped not just by her gender, but also by her race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, disability, and other aspects of her identity. The impact of historical trauma and systemic oppression on mental health is gaining much-needed attention. Looking ahead, what does the future hold for treating women's anxiety? We might see more personalized approaches to treatment, perhaps guided by genetic research or more sophisticated brain imaging. Digital mental health tools, apps, online therapy platforms, virtual reality exposure therapy, are becoming increasingly common, potentially improving accessibility, though raising questions about privacy and effectiveness. There's a growing movement towards trauma-informed care, recognizing the prevalence of trauma in women's histories and integrating this understanding into treatment. And hopefully, there will be a continued push to address the societal factors that contribute to anxiety, advocating for policies that support women's well-being, reduce inequality, and challenge harmful gender norms. A quirky or fringe tidbit emerging in recent years is research exploring the potential of psychedelic-assisted therapy for conditions like PTSD and severe depression, which often co-occur with anxiety, hinting at radical new pharmacological approaches that are a far cry from the tranquilizers of the mid-20th century, but remain highly experimental and controversial. Imagine treating your anxiety with a carefully controlled psychedelic journey, guided by a therapist. Definitely not your grandmother's Valium. So, here we are, at the end of our journey through millennia of attempts to understand and soothe women's anxiety. From wandering wombs and noxious fumes to delicate nerves and rest cures, from talking cures and tranquilizers to neurotransmitters and CBT, the approaches have been incredibly varied, sometimes bizarre, often influenced by the social and medical biases of the time, but always aimed at alleviating a very real human experience. We've learned that women's anxiety has often been seen through a lens that pathologizes their bodies and their nature, but also that people have always sought relief and understanding. As the lamp flickers softly now, casting gentle shadows around the room, feel the weight of that long history settle, not as a burden, but as a story told. Recognize the echoes of the past and how we still talk about stress or nerves, but also appreciate how far we've come in understanding the intricate dance of biology, mind, and environment that shapes our anxious moments. Allow the images to soften, the ancient baths, the medieval herbs, the Victorian parlors, the quiet analyst's office, the modern therapist's room. They are part of a long lineage of human effort to find peace within ourselves. You are here, safe in this moment, having witnessed the journey. Let the historical details fade now, like whispers on the edge of sleep. Just breathe softly, feeling the quiet rhythm of your own body, letting go of the stories and the struggles of the past. There is only this moment, peaceful and still. The journey is complete. Rest now.